So the Zhou justified their takeover of the Shang, but also all sorts of other territories, by claiming basically moral superiority over those people. And to accomplish that, they create an ideology that supports a morally correct transfer of power. They call this the mandate of heaven. So if we think back to Indian civilizations who use kind of stories that integrate them into a larger cosmology and talk about why there are kings, if we think about the ancient Mesopotamians and the law codes that say Hammurabi develops, here we've got a different approach. So this thing that they develop and call the mandate of heaven begins kind of as a religious compact, a religious agreement between the Zhou people and a supreme god in heaven, a god that they consider the sky god. But it doesn't really stay religious. It evolves into something that's more kind of a Chinese political doctrine. So here's the main argument of it. Since worldly affairs are supposed to align with those in heaven, since if things are going well on earth, that probably signifies that people are doing something right and the gods are rewarding them in that way. Then what that means is that if somebody's in power, the gods want them to be in power. It's kind of a self-fulfilling prophecy, right? But if things are good, gods want it that way, and if the ruler's good, that's great. If things are bad, the gods want it that way, but they might want somebody else to rule. So in this mandate of heaven, the ruler is supposed to uphold a harmonious idea of balance and honor. And what's tricky about this is that any ruler who fails, who lets instability creep into earthly affairs, who lets his people suffer, loses this mandate. And that means that there's kind of a prerogative of spiritual powers to withdraw support from dynasties who aren't doing right, and instead find somebody else who can do the job better. So what this means is the mandate of heaven, and early on by proxy sky gods, kind of legitimize changes in regime or changes in dynasties. So using this mandate, the Zhou have to acknowledge that any ruler can be ousted from power if they lose the mandate. What does the mandate look like? Rebellions, uprisings, drought, anything that throws society and civilization out of whack. After the Zhou overrun the Shang rulers aren't considered gods anymore, but from now on, dynastic legitimacy really depends on ruling in accordance with principles of good government and upright behavior. And towards the end of this lecture, we're going to see some philosophies that espouse this a little bit more. That means from here on out, China's rulers create an empire based on politics, on military power, on morality to support their legitimacy, and religion doesn't really come into play like we've seen elsewhere. Some things that they take from the Zhou, I've already mentioned these a little bit, that they adopt the practice of writing in divination, kind of trying to predict the will of the gods, but they expand it. They use it to record things like kingly speeches, grants of office, rewards that people are given. Other texts that have been found include those that describe organization and administration of government. And writing becomes particularly important under a king by the name of Mu, M-U. He reigns right around the turn of the millennium, 956 to 918 BC, just to put this in context a little bit. And it becomes more important because he establishes a more formal and organized government, a better bureaucracy. So he restructures his royal court and the military by appointing folks that aren't related to him, but people who are good at their jobs is a way to think about it. And he also institutes a formal legal code. So here we are 800 years after Hammurabi, almost 900. Those two changes create a need for records, bureaucratic records. You need archives of appointment and of legal verdicts. And what that means is that now you've got need for people to learn this really complex language of hundreds, if not thousands, of different characters. So now there are a pool of scribes and scholars that join the diviners using a mastery of writing to improve themselves in their lot. Remember that the Shang had developed a couple of calendars, a lunar and a solar one. Well, one duty of the king here was creating, and maybe a privilege is a better way of thinking it, creating a royal calendar. And why that calendar is important is it defines when people do what, especially related to agricultural practices. When do you plant seeds? When do you harvest? When do you water? And when are you going to celebrate rituals related to those things? Well, since that's a prerogative of these folks, and because they claim to obtain their power from heaven, they make a really great effort to gain an accurate knowledge of the stars, to predict astronomical systems that their calendars are based on. The Chinese are fantastic at astronomy. They improve what the Shang have done. They realize that the year is actually a little bit off from 365. So they actually create a year that is measured as 365 and a quarter days. It's actually closer to 365.24, but that's pretty darn good for 3,000 years ago. But within that, they force lunar months that go according to seasons. And they have 12 different lunar months, and you know that 365 doesn't divide by 12 all that well. So their lunar months only add up to 354, which means that occasionally they'll insert not a leap day, but a leap month to bring things kind of back in line. Thinking about their number systems, scribes record the dates of kings by days and years within a repeating cycle of 60, so we're back to the base 12. Another thing that they take from the Shang, and we see this in the next slide, is the use of bronze, especially in terms of ritual vessels, statues, ornaments, weapons. They develop a really extensive system of bronze metalworking that requires lots of bronze, lots of people providing it to them. That means that if they find areas where they can mine the appropriate resources, they often forcibly transport people to those towns and establish colonies there. So they learn a lot from the Shang, like reverence for their predecessors, the importance of inheritance, but they also face some new obstacles, which we'll explore next.